Morning.
I thought you might know a little bit about the gas supply that we get coming from the Russians, because seemingly Vladimir Putin has decided that it's time to teach us all a bit of a lesson. So they're apparently withholding some gas because they want to build another pipeline.
Well, I don't think that's really a very fair summary of things. So what's actually happened is that we've neglected to keep up our own reserves of gas. Normally, we'd have much larger reserves. We used to have a great hole in the ground called the Rough Field, where we kept a very large reserve, which would last us several days, if not weeks, and we've allowed that to lapse. So we are almost totally reliant on immediate supplies. And there's a huge increase in demand for gas from Asia at the moment. Which has happened at precisely the wrong time. What Putin's up to is he's trying to put pressure on everybody in the European Union to let him go ahead with the so-called Nord Stream pipeline, which enables him to avoid sending gas through Ukraine, which he no longer wants to do. It's a separate issue. And also Russia has its own domestic pressures. To concentrate on the Russian aspect of this is wrong.
No, I wasn't intending to do that.
No,
I just
the people
thought...
who are really at fault are British governments, which over the years have pursued dogmatic green policies, particularly getting rid of our own domestic coal-fired ability to produce energy, concentrating very heavily on hugely subsidised wind power, which of course doesn't work when the wind doesn't blow, and on all kinds of projects such as the development of battery storage, which is in its infancy and may never get beyond its infancy, biomass, for goodness sake, which doesn't really solve any problems at all. And what we do when we close coal-fired power stations is not, you might say, well, we oughtn't to be burning coal because it's quite dirty. When we close the coal-fired power stations, we don't keep them in mothballs in case we should need them again, despite the huge cost of building them and the immense amount of engineering in them. We blow them up.
Yeah.
So they're just gone. And the one nearest to me, Didcot A, was first of all shut and blown up a couple of years ago, and we simply don't have it if we need it. When the Germans a few years ago panicked over the Fukushima nuclear power station non-disaster, where actually the power station survived remarkably well an earthquake and a tsunami, they got rid of a lot of nuclear power and went over to coal in a big way. And everybody has gone over to gas because it doesn't look as bad as coal, although it is, of course, a fossil fuel and anything but carbon neutral. And there's been enormous pressure on gas. What we also do in this country is we use French nuclear power coming over the connector, and also power from the Netherlands and even from Ireland and from Norway, which comes into this country to make up for the fact that we can't power our own country or industry anymore. And the problem with this is, especially since we left the European Union, that the obligations of European Union countries to supply us with energy through connectors are much weaker than they were before. And if they find they have a priority that makes them want to hang on to their own electricity, they won't send it to us. And it really is quite serious.
I think it's very serious, Peter. And I wasn't.
It's the result of green dogma.
Yes, well, that was precisely my next. That was precisely be my next point, because I was not in any way trying to make out that it was all down to the Russians. What I was saying is that it's part of it. And I said earlier on, I had John Redwood on this morning, and I said to him, "Is this not the result of our headlong obsession with reducing carbon emissions and becoming a green economy?" And this is where we now are.
Well, it is, but the ridiculous thing is that in the course of becoming supposedly green, we've switched from one form of fossil fuel, coal, to another one, gas. And indeed, the absolute emergency provisions, if things go belly up, involve huge numbers of diesel generators scattered around the country, which would kick in at the same time as industry being asked to shut down various activities to lessen the load on the power system. We might get power cuts. What's more likely is that industries will be required to reduce their demand, which will have a similar effect, but it won't mean your lights suddenly go out one afternoon. But we are seriously constrained with power in this country, and it's the other big problem is that the danger of power cuts is increased, because unless you've got big gas or coal power plants or nuclear power plants in large numbers, a thing called inertia, which is a kind of pressure in the power system, weakens and in some cases disappears. And when you haven't got enough inertia, you're much more vulnerable to power cuts if things flip and flop. And this is what happened in August, I think, 2019. When we had a sudden power cut, which put a lot of things out of action. And the problem with power cuts in the modern world is so much of our life is dependent upon computers. And so many very complicated things like railway locomotives are now hugely computerized. But if they do fail, it can take hours or even days to get them back in operation again. You can't just switch it on the way you used to be able to. So the vulnerability is extraordinary. And it just amazes me that so little provision has been made for anything to go wrong. And that is going very seriously wrong.
Yes, and you're absolutely right.
The dominant story of the next few months, if this country hasn't got enough power to keep its agriculture and its food industry going, and to keep itself warm properly, and in general to maintain industry, that is at least as big a crisis as COVID.
Oh, I think so. And you're quite right to point out the storage problem, because I was asking this question, I think 7 or 8 years ago for the first time. Why did we shut down the storage facilities, and why did we not build more storage facilities in the North Sea, which you could very easily do, and there have been companies offering to do it, but no government has ever decided it was worthwhile.
Well, there's a general view in government that it would be all right. And of course, anybody who makes these policies based on the fact it will be all right is invariably caught out by events. And this is the case. I had argued many years ago that instead of spending all these multi-billions on Trident's submarine replacement, which we're about to do, that we would guarantee our independence from foreign interference much more if we stopped all the whole Trident replacement and spent the money on building our own system of nuclear power generation, as France did many years ago, and therefore made ourselves energy independent. And indeed became an energy exporter again, which we used to be before the gas fields began to dry up that we so luckily found in the 1970s. So, but nobody paid any attention to this, or everybody said I was mad. And because the other problem is that during the course of privatization, that greatly overrated activity, we pretty much dismantled our ability to make our own nuclear power stations, something we used to be quite good at. And so we became dependent on anybody we could buy in to do it. The latest dalliance is with the Chinese, which isn't working out very well, and they take a long time to build. So if when I said it, someone had paid any attention, it might do any good. But if we now embarked, as we probably should, on a huge nuclear power station building program, it would be 20 to 25 years before it would save us from the problems we face. And as I say, we are so dependent on our neighbours for supplying power that it is extremely worrying to anybody who takes this seriously. And the price of gas and the way in which it's now rising is terrifying, particularly for people on tight budgets. And they may have fixed prices now, but how long will they last?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, even without this particular latest crisis of the gas prices being hiked, October was already going to see people's prices, people's energy bills going up by as much as 35% anyway. So I mean, people are paying a fortune in this country now.
Yeah, and remember those bills. You look at your power bill; they're padded with things called social obligations. Now, much of that is, of course, helping people who can't afford to buy their power. And I think most of us would say that we're willing to do that. But the social obligations also include green subsidies, which we've been compelled to pay by stealth, in my view, for many, many years. Which is why the makers of renewable power keep saying how cheap it is. It's cheap because it's subsidised.
Right. And it's not actually that cheap. It's only started to get a little bit cheaper relatively recently. But as somebody pointed out to me this morning, imagine if we were all driving around electric cars. Where would that leave us?
Well, there would be no way of charging them. It wouldn't be possible. The other thing to bear in mind is that wind power is, in fact, you think, well, you put up a windmill, it'll be there forever. But in fact, they don't have very good lasting qualities. And in fact, they break down and become obsolete and cease to work properly after a remarkably short period of time. So they then need to be replaced at enormous expense as well, not to mention the huge cost of rigging up the pylons to connect them to the power system.
It's really quite extraordinary. Let's move on to something you wrote about this weekend, and what I would regard as kind of peak COVID-idiocy. But in the opposite direction, people used to call people COVID-idiots if they were supposedly, carefree and didn't pay too much attention to the rules. This is the opposite. People paying so much attention to COVID rules that they're falling down on escalators because they were not gripping the handrail. It's quite extraordinary.
I know it is so sad that you hear someone goes on the London Underground and they're so terrified that they will pick up COVID from the escalator handrail, which I have to say is statistically almost impossible, that they don't hold onto the handrail, they fall down the stairs and they're then quite seriously injured or even killed. It's a metaphor for the rule of fear in this matter. A rule of fear which, as I say, spread by a group whom I call the COVID Hezbollah, fanatics who are constantly trying to spread this new faith including its special garments which you have to wear and special ways in which you have to behave, who are waiting for the opportunity to plunge us into yet another retreat into undiluted home life and economic self-strangulation. And absolutely no guarantee that we will get through the coming winter without them doing that. And by the way, I discovered, after using the expression COVID Hezbollah, somebody wrote to me from Germany saying, hadn't heard that before, but here we call them the COVID witnesses.
Well,
That wasn't bad.
It's a bit like the cycling Taliban, as brought in by, I think it was Richard Littlejohn who sort of named.
But I'm in the cycling Taliban, so I can't really.
Yes, no, I suppose you are, but you don't. Well, you're not really. But
I don't actually carry a rocket launcher, but I do bicycle about quite a bit.
I saw a great cartoon, actually, incidentally, at the weekend. I think it was in Rod Liddell's column, where it's the Afghan sort of assembled Taliban government talking about Dominic Raab being appointed, and the one guy saying, "Oh, I didn't realise that he had been appointed to a new job. I was on holiday at the time," which I thought was rather good.
That man will never be able to take a holiday again for the rest of his life.
I was amused as well by your continued arguments on Twitter about the metric system, because I mean, I've been saying to people, it's a bit of a distraction. We kind of have a mixed system anyway, but I really like your arguments about why metric is not so good, because it's not really based on anything.
Well, it isn't based on, but here's the thing. I sort of care about it a bit. I'm upset to see what I think are the beautiful human old measures that I grew up with and know very well being abolished by law. I went, it's 20 years now, up to Sunderland when Steve Thoburn, a greengrocer there, was actually prosecuted for selling bananas by the pound weight to a customer who wanted to buy bananas by the pound weight. What kind of legal system prosecutes somebody for that, I do not know.
Yeah.
I thought this had gone too far. And I began to look into it a bit and read up on it. And I came to the conclusion that there's a huge fanaticism behind the metric system. You remember, it was introduced by the French revolutionaries. In fact, the Directory in 1799 were the ones who plonked it down. And they were actually trying to remove all the landmarks of old society. That was when they got rid of all the old French provinces, all the old equivalents of our county boundaries, changed the names of everything, began the world over again. It's a revolutionary thing, and it's funny that in the gaps between murdering huge numbers of people and cutting the king's head off, they still managed to pursue this activity because they think it was so important. And yet, what I get is metricators attacking me for caring about it.
Right.
Well, they're the ones who get every time there's a revolution or an invasion. That's how the metric system largely spreads. I mean, there are exceptions. My favourite exception being apartheid South Africa. When, if you may remember, in the 60s, they broke away from the British Commonwealth and abandoned the monarchy. One of the first things they did was they went metric and decimal to emphasise that they weren't British anymore, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yes.
It's not necessarily a left-wing revolutionary thing, and right-wing revolutionaries are keen on it as well. But say any of this, and you're surrounded immediately by a huge swarm of metricating midges, biting and stinging and shouting at you, fanatic!
Right.
Why do you care about this? My answer to this is I care about it because they care about it.
Yes, and I think that's true, isn't it? Because I think there is, and I said this to Christine Jardine, who apparently jokingly put out a tweet. She's a Liberal Democrat MP for Edinburgh West. Jokingly put out a tweet saying, "I don't actually know what any imperial measurements are." She told me that was ironic. As I said to her, you should know better than to use irony on Twitter because nobody really gets that. But I mean, I try and explain, for example, pounds, shillings, and pence to my children, and they look at me as if I'm talking, in gobbledygook to them. Why would you have? What's a guinea? When 20 guineas is what? How does that work? They look at it as a very illogical system.
Well, the guinea was the old equivalent of VAT.
Yes.
You could charge an extra 5% on anything. That was what that was. And lawyers and people like that always charged in guineas rather than pounds, so they'd increase their bills. But I've got no affection for the guinea. But the thing about the old measures is that they had a different measure for each purpose. So when you're doing woodwork, a lot of people who do woodwork, I won't say most, appreciate the fact that you've got inches for certain types of work and feet for others. And again, with weighing things, some things are better weighed in ounces, and some better in pounds, better in stones, and some in hundredweights and tons. That was one of the things about what I call the customary system. The imperial system makes it sound as if it's to do with Cecil Rhodes, which it isn't. It is customary, and it's based on the other thing about customary measures is they're based largely on the human body. and on things that humans do. A pound is pretty much what you can hold comfortably in your hand. We know what a foot is. We know what an inch is, and a yard is a pace. So it starts with the human body and the individual. The metric system starts with the state and some committee saying this is what you will measure things in, whether you like it or not. Even Napoleon Bonaparte couldn't stand it. The man who codified the whole of Europe, he said the French were being driven mad by the metric system, so he modified it and introduced semi-metric measurements, which are still used in France. You buy butter privately from a farmer in Normandy, he'll sell it to you in livres, which is roughly a pound. And that's the result of Napoleon doing that. And I keep making this point about metric measures being cold and arbitrary and ill-sized. France went metric 220 years ago. One of the biggest industries and the proudest industry in France is wine. You try and buy a bottle of decent wine in a litre bottle, you go and find it. No, even after 220 years, they still sell it in a bottle. And do you know what the bottle is the equivalent of in English measures?
Well, I don't know what it is, but I read
I'll tell you what
that
is.
it was an amount of wine for two people, wasn't it?
It's the equivalent of what used to be called in English measures a bottle.
Ah.
That's what they called it.
Right.
It was just the right size where two people wanted to sit down with a bottle. That's what it was. And 220 years of the metric system, and they haven't got rid of it. Why? Because the litre is inconvenient and not quite the right size. And here's another thing. In all the countries with metric measurements, you go to the schools, look at the rulers that the children are carrying. They're 30 centimetres long. What's 30 centimetres? It's a foot.
Right.
The metric system doesn't have a foot, except it makes foot-long rulers for school children. Why is that? Because the metre is an inconvenient, far too long, unwieldy measure. Unit, I should say.
Yes. But I think the trouble is that it's a generational thing as well. Because, I mean, I still don't know how tall I am in metres. I have no idea. I do know how tall I am in feet and inches. Similarly, whenever they say expect 4 millimetres of rain or 4 centimetres of rain, I have to check on Google how many inches that is, because I don't really know. I'm not sure. Whereas I think for my kids who are teenagers, it's the complete opposite.
I don't know. I think a lot of people still use in private life you ask most people, quite young people, how tall they are. They'll give it you in feet and inches, and how much they weigh. They'll give it you in stones and pounds.
Yeah.
And the Neil Heron made this great remark that when the weight of a baby is given out a newborn is given out in kilograms, people can't work out whether it's the size of a large tomato or a small elephant. Unless you give it in pounds and ounces, nobody knows how big the baby is. Because people can't visualize metric measurements. And that's another thing about them. They are hard. I mean, I was taught both.
Well, I'm intrigued as well by the bag of sugar analogy. You know, when they say, oh, it's about the size of a bag of sugar. You know, needless to say, there are many sizes of bags of sugar, but I imagine a bag of sugar to be a pound.
Yeah. Or maybe two. But I mean, here's another thing. When I was growing up, you bought a jar of marmalade. It was a pound jar. That was the size.
Yeah.
And once you get rid of the pound and you can just slide it along in however many grams you choose to sell it in, then what happens is you carry on selling the thing at the same price, but the number of grams goes down. So you look at a lot of jam jars now, they're down to 400 or 415 grams, when the equivalent of a pound was 453. So they started out at 453 and they price gouged. And the thing about the customary measures, again, is they were landmarks. And once you get rid of the landmarks, people can fiddle around with things, and it has made price gouging a lot of that kind a lot easier.
Yes.
If you look carefully at the actual metric weights of things, so which used to be pound equivalents, they're now much smaller.
Well, I think if you probably found out how much a gallon of petrol costs now, you'd be absolutely horrified, because I mean it's high enough. It's now 135 or something in litres.
But I think people buy petrol by the pound sterling now, don't they?
Yeah, I think so.
They talk roughly what to fill a tank, and then they don't really calculate in litres. A lot of people in open markets, in England and Ireland too, buy their fruit and vegetables not by the kilogram but by the bulb. At least they can see what they're buying. But people, and you get an awful lot of measurements can do. It's such and such that so many times the height of a London bus, or so many times the size of a football stadium. Because if you gave it in meters, a lot of people wouldn't know what you're talking about.
Yes.
They don't form a picture in the head.
No. Shoes is another one. I went to buy a pair of shoes the other day. I couldn't find any shoes that were measured in anything other than European measurements, like 42, 43, 44, you know. And when I was asked what size my feet were, I said, well, it's usually a 10. It could be a 9.5. And the woman looked at me like I was speaking Japanese.
Yeah, that's strange. I thought I hadn't found that difficult. You know what shoe sizes are measured in, don't you?
No, feet.
So what your 9.5 are?
No.
Barleycorns.
Is that right? You see, this is what I was finding fascinating reading your tweets. Barleycorns.
Barleycorn, 9.5 barleycorns long. That's your feet, and it is that is an old English measure. They're quite picturesque, aren't they?
That's lovely. That is lovely. I recommend everyone should read Peter's descriptions of these things because they're very good. Peter, we're out of time, sadly. Thank you very much indeed. Very amusing conversation about the metric system and why the imperial